The gym buzzed with excitement as students, parents, and fans packed the bleachers for one of the biggest high school basketball games of the season. The rivalry between the two teams was legendary, and tonight's game promised to be nothing short of electric. Cheers echoed off the walls, the rhythmic stomping of feet creating a palpable energy that pulsed through the crowd. At center court, players warmed up with an intensity that showed just how much this game meant to them. But amidst the thrill of competition, one figure stood out quiet, focused, and seemingly unfazed by the chaos around him. He was the only black player on his team, a lean, confident young man who carried himself with a calm that belied his age. His presence on the court was magnetic, but it wasn't just his skill that drew attention. Whispers rippled through the stands as people craned their necks to get a better look at him. Who was this kid? Some recognized him, others didn't, but everyone seemed to have an opinion. And as the game unfolded, it became clear that not all of those opinions were kind. It started with a few jeers from the opposing side, playful at first, the kind of harmless trash talk that often comes with high-stakes games. But as the game progressed, the tone shifted. The comments became louder, sharper, more pointed. "Go back to where you came from," someone shouted. Laughter rippled through a pocket of the crowd. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't even glance in their direction. Instead, he kept his focus on the ball, his teammates, and the game plan. But the insults didn't stop. They grew louder, uglier, and more personal, echoing through the gym like a dark cloud trying to smother the light. Parents and coaches shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to step in or let it blow over. The referee, clearly aware of what was happening, glanced at the stands but made no move to intervene. On the sidelines, the boys' coach watched him closely, as if waiting to see whether the taunts would rattle his composure. But the boy didn't give them the satisfaction. He played on, every dribble, every pass, every shot a quiet defiance. Then, something unexpected happened. During a timeout, one of his teammates, a popular player known for his charm and quick wit, turned to the crowd and raised his voice. "Y'all need to chill," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't even know who you're talking about." The gym fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Whispers and murmurs broke out as people tried to make sense of what he meant. What was it about this boy that commanded such loyalty from his teammate? And why did it feel like there was something everyone else was missing? As the timeout ended and the players returned to the court, the tension in the gym was almost unbearable. All eyes were on the boy now, the jeers replaced by a heavy, curious silence. What was his story? What was the truth that everyone seemed to be on the verge of discovering? The game resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. The focus was no longer on the scoreboard but on this young man who had quietly endured so much. And as the final buzzer approached, the question on everyone's mind was the same: who was he really? What was it about him that made his teammates speak up, that made the crowd's mockery seem so misguided? No one could have guessed what was coming next. As the second half of the game began, the boy took his place on the court, his movements sharp and deliberate. The whispers in the stands hadn't stopped. If anything, they grew louder, filled with speculation and curiosity. People leaned into each other, sharing guesses and theories about who he was. Some thought he must be related to someone famous. Others wondered if he was a transfer student with a story nobody had heard yet. But the boy didn't seem to notice any of it. His focus never wavered. To him, it was just basketball, every play an opportunity to prove himself without saying a word. The opposing team ramped up their intensity, and so did their fans. The taunts returned, more cutting now, aimed not just at the boy's skills but at his very presence. "You don't belong here," someone shouted, their voice dripping with contempt. This time, a few heads turned toward the heckler, their expressions a mix of disapproval and discomfort. The coach on the boys' team clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between the stands and his player. He looked like he wanted to say something but held back, perhaps out of fear of escalating the situation. The boy's teammates rallied around him. They passed him the ball more often, set better screens, and called out plays designed to give him space. It was subtle, but anyone paying attention could see they were trying to shield him from the ugliness pouring out of the stands. The boy rewarded their efforts with precision. Every move he made was calculated, every shot taken with confidence. His skill was undeniable, and by the fourth quarter, even some of the opposing fans couldn't help but clap when he scored. But the mystery of who he was lingered. During a brief break in play, a teacher sitting near the front row leaned over to the person next to her. "He's not just a good player," she said quietly. "He's a good kid." Straight, a student, volunteers at the community center. "He's different." The person nodded, intrigued but still unsure what she meant. The teacher didn't elaborate, leaving the comment hanging in the air. On the court, the boy was a force. But off the court, his life was far more complicated than anyone in the gym realized. Born and raised in a small, tight-knit community, he had faced challenges from an early age. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat, and his father, a former college athlete, had instilled in him a love for basketball as a way to channel his frustrations and find purpose. But it wasn't just basketball that defined him. He was the kind of person who stopped to help a stranger on the street, who stayed late after school to tutor younger students, who showed up for people even when they didn't show up for him. None of this was common knowledge, though. To the crowd in the gym, he was just a name on a roster, a kid with undeniable talent and an unshakable demeanor. The hecklers didn't see the hours he spent practicing in an old, run-down gym with a cracked floor and flickering lights. They didn't see the late nights spent studying after a long day of school and practice. They didn't know the sacrifices his family had made to support him, or the quiet determination that drove him to succeed. As the game reached its final minutes, the tension in the gym was palpable. The score was tied, and every play felt like it could decide the outcome. The boy had the ball, weaving through defenders with a grace that seemed almost effortless. The crowd held its breath as he drove to the basket, leaping high and releasing the ball with perfect form. The gym erupted as the ball swished through the net, giving his team a 2-point lead. But just as quickly as the cheers started, they were interrupted. A voice from the stands yelled something so cruel, so deeply cutting, that it silenced the entire gym. The boy paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. He turned his head slightly, as if to acknowledge the insult, but then he straightened his shoulders and walked calmly back to his position. His teammates looked furious, their fists clenched and their faces set in hard lines. The coach called a timeout, pulling the team into a huddle and speaking to them in low, urgent tones. In the stands, a ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, and a few people began murmuring that the heckler had gone too far. But the boy's composure seemed to unsettle them even more. How could he stay so calm? Why didn't he react? It was as if he knew something they didn't, as if he held a secret that made their words meaningless. The game resumed, and the boys' team held on to their lead, winning by a narrow margin. As the final buzzer sounded, the gym erupted in cheers and applause, but the boy's expression didn't change. He shook hands with the opposing team, exchanged a few words with his coach, and started walking toward the locker room. The crowd parted for him like a wave, their eyes following him with a mix of awe and curiosity. He didn't acknowledge them, didn't pause to soak in the moment. He just kept walking, his face calm, his stride steady. But just as he reached the edge of the gym, someone called out his name, a voice filled with urgency and something else, something that sounded like fear. The boy stopped and turned, his eyes meeting those of the person who had spoken. For a moment, the gym was silent again, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The boy's gaze didn't waver, and neither did the voice that had called out to him. It was clear that something was about to happen, something that would change the way everyone in that gym saw him forever. The boy froze for a moment, his back still to the crowd. The voice that called his name was unfamiliar, but it carried a weight that made him turn slowly. A man stood near the edge of the bleachers, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the dim gym lights. He wasn't a parent or a teacher, he didn't fit the usual crowd at high school games. His clothes were plain, but his posture and expression hinted at something deeper, something that didn't belong in the chaos of a basketball game. The gym seemed to hold its collective breath as the boy looked at the man. They locked eyes, and for a second, the boy's calm mask slipped. There was something there, a flicker of recognition, confusion, maybe even anger. But just as quickly, he smoothed it over and turned away, walking toward the locker room without another glance. The man didn't follow, but his presence lingered like a shadow over the gym. People whispered among themselves, speculating about who he was and why he had called out to the boy. Some thought he might be a recruiter, others a relative or mentor. But the truth felt far more complicated. In the locker room, the boy sat quietly, his teammates celebrating around him. They shouted, laughed, and slapped each other on the back, their earlier tension replaced with the relief of victory. But the boy stayed silent, staring at the floor as if lost in thought. One of his teammates noticed and nudged him. "You good?" he asked, his voice low. The boy nodded without looking up. "Yeah," he said. "Just tired." The teammate hesitated, then nodded, accepting the answer even though it didn't feel complete. Meanwhile, outside the gym, the man lingered near the parking lot, pacing in the cold night air. He seemed to be waiting for someone, his movements restless but purposeful. A few parents glanced at him as they walked by, their curiosity tempered by a sense of unease. Something about him felt out of place, like he was part of a story no one else could see. When the boy finally emerged from the locker room, his head down and his bag slung over one shoulder, the man stepped forward. "Hey," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the boy. The boy stopped but didn't turn around. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone flat. The man hesitated, then took a step closer. "I just need a minute," he said. "It's important." The boy finally turned, his expression guarded. "I don't know you," he said. "And I don't have time for this." He started to walk away, but the man's next words stopped him cold. "You're wrong," he said. "You do know me. You just don't remember." The boy froze, his grip tightening on his bag. For a moment, he didn't say anything, didn't move. Then he turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the man. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and tense. The man sighed, his expression a mix of regret and determination. "I'm someone who's been looking for you for a long time," he said. "And I think it's time you knew the truth." The boy's teammates, still hanging out near the gym doors, noticed the exchange and started to drift closer. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they could see the tension between the two. One of them called out, "Hey, you good, man?" The boy glanced over his shoulder and gave a quick nod. "Yeah," he said. "I'm fine." But his voice sounded strained, and his teammates exchanged uneasy glances. The man stepped back, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I just need to talk to you. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." The boy hesitated, his instincts warring with his curiosity. Finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said. 5 minutes. They moved a few steps away from the gym doors, out of earshot but still visible to the boy's teammates. The man spoke in a low, urgent voice, his words coming fast and heavy. The boy listened, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that looked like anger. He shook his head several times, his body tense as if he was ready to walk away at any moment. But he didn't. Whatever the man was saying, it was enough to keep him rooted in place. Back inside, the gym had mostly emptied out. A few stragglers lingered, talking in hushed tones about the man who had appeared out of nowhere and the boy who seemed to be at the center of everything. The teacher from earlier stood near the concession stand, her brow furrowed as she watched the boy through the glass doors. She didn't know what was going on, but she could sense that whatever it wasn't something that would blow over easily. Outside, the man's voice grew more insistent. "I'm not asking you to believe me right now," he said. "I just want you to think about what I'm saying. You have a right to know." The boy shook his head again, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice rising. "You don't know what I've been through." The man's face softened. "You're right," he said. "I don't know everything. But I know enough. And I know you deserve answers." The boy stepped back, shaking his head one last time. "I don't need your answers," he said. "I'm doing fine on my own." With that, he turned and walked away, his stride quick and purposeful. The man didn't follow. He just stood there, watching as the boy disappeared into the night. But the look on his face said he wasn't giving up, not yet. The boy's teammates caught up to him a few minutes later, their concern etched into their faces. "What was that about?" one of them asked. The boy shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. "Nothing," he said. "Just some guy who thought he knew me." But his voice didn't match the words, and his teammates could tell there was more to the story. Still, they didn't press him. They knew better than to push when he wasn't ready to talk. As they walked toward the parking lot, the boy's mind raced. The man's words echoed in his head, fragments of a story he wasn't sure he believed or wanted to believe. He didn't know what to make of it yet, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Whatever the truth was, it had just begun to surface, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. But ready or not, it was coming. And it would change everything. The boy walked home in the quiet of the night, his bag heavy on his shoulder, his mind even heavier. The words the man had said swirled in his head, refusing to settle. He wanted to forget them, to brush off the encounter as just another distraction, but it wasn't that simple. The man had said things only someone who really knew him could have known, things the boy had never shared with anyone. And that look in his eyes, like he was holding on to a truth too big to ignore, had been impossible to shake. At home, the boy's mother was waiting for him, her usual tired but warm smile fading when she saw his face. "You okay?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. He nodded, avoiding her eyes. "Just a long game," he said, his tone clipped. She didn't push, but her gaze lingered on him as he went to his room and shut the door. She knew him well enough to sense when something was wrong, but she also knew he'd tell her when he was ready, or so she hoped. Inside his room, the boy dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall. His room was small and plain, decorated only with a few posters of his favorite players and a shelf of trophies that marked his dedication to the game. Basketball had always been his escape, his way of proving he was more than the challenges life had thrown at him. But tonight, even basketball couldn't drown out the noise in his head. The man's voice echoed again, "You have a right to know." "Know what?" The boy's hands clenched into fists as he replayed the conversation, trying to make sense of it. The man had mentioned things about his past, hints that didn't quite fit the story he'd grown up with. He talked about choices, sacrifices, and truths that had been hidden for years. But the boy didn't want to believe it. How could he? His life wasn't perfect, but it was his. He'd fought for everything he had, and the idea that there was something bigger at play, something beyond his control, was almost too much to bear. The next day at school, the atmosphere was different. Word about the man had spread, and people were buzzing with curiosity. Some of the boy's classmates tried to ask him about it, but he brushed them off with a shrug and a muttered, "It's nothing." Even his closest friends could tell he was on edge, but they respected his silence. Still, the whispers followed him through the halls, a constant reminder that whatever had started the night before wasn't going away. That afternoon, during practice, the boy threw himself into the game with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. He played harder, faster, pushing himself past his limits as if trying to outrun his thoughts. His coach finally blew the whistle and pulled him aside. "What's going on with you?" the coach asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The boy shook his head, wiping sweat from his face. "Nothing," he said. "I'm fine." The coach didn't look convinced, but he let it go. "Take it easy," he said. "You're no good to the team if you burn out." After practice, the boy stayed late, shooting basket after basket in the empty gym. The rhythm of the ball hitting the floor was soothing, almost hypnotic. But even that couldn't quiet his mind. He kept seeing the man's face, hearing his words, feeling the weight of something he didn't fully understand pressing down on him. When he finally left the gym, the parking lot was deserted. Or so he thought. As he walked toward his bike, he spotted a figure leaning against a lamppost. It was the man. The boy froze, his heart pounding. He considered turning back, pretending he hadn't seen him, but something made him keep walking. "You again?" the boy said, his voice sharper than he intended. The man straightened, his expression calm but serious. "I told you I wasn't going to give up," he said. The boy crossed his arms, his stance defensive. "Why? What do you want from me?" The man took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for what he was about to say. "I want you to understand," he said. "This isn't just about you. It's bigger than that." The boy's frustration boiled over. "I don't care about bigger," he snapped. "I don't care about your story, or your truth, or whatever you think I need to hear. My life is fine. I don't need you messing it up." The man didn't flinch at the outburst. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice low but intense. "What if I told you your life isn't what you think it is?" he said. "That the things you've been told, the things you've believed, aren't the whole story?" The boy stared at him, his chest heaving with anger and confusion. He didn't want to listen, didn't want to believe there was anything more to his life than what he already knew. But a small, stubborn part of him couldn't ignore the man's words. What if he was right? What if there was something he didn't know, something that could change everything? Before he could respond, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He held it out to the boy, his hand steady. "Take this," he said. "Read it when you're ready. It's not everything, but it's a start." The boy hesitated, his gaze flicking between the envelope and the man's face. Finally, with a sigh, he snatched it from the man's hand. "This doesn't mean I believe you," he said. The man nodded. "I know," he said. "But it means you're curious. And that's enough." The boy stuffed the envelope into his pocket and walked away, his mind a storm of emotions. He didn't look back, but he could feel the man's eyes on him as he left. As he pedaled home, the envelope burned against his leg, its weight far heavier than it should have been. He didn't know what it contained, but he knew one thing for certain: opening it would be a turning point. And once he did, there would be no going back. The boy lay awake that night, staring at the envelope on his nightstand. He had tossed and turned for hours, trying to ignore it, but its presence felt like a weight on his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he thought of the man's words and the intensity in his voice. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was something deeper, something unsettling that he couldn't shake. With a frustrated sigh, he reached over, grabbed the envelope, and sat up. The paper was rough and slightly yellowed, like it had been handled 100 times before. His fingers trembled as he slid his thumb under the flap and pulled out the contents: a single sheet of paper and an old photograph. The photo caught his eye first. It was a picture of a man and a woman, smiling broadly, standing in front of a modest house. The boy's breath hitched as he realized the woman looked familiar, too familiar. She was younger in the photo, her hair a little different, but there was no mistaking it. It was his mother. His hands tightened around the edges of the photo as he turned his attention to the paper. It was a letter, handwritten in neat but slightly shaky script. The words were direct, almost painfully so. They talked about choices made years ago, about sacrifices and secrets. The boy's eyes widened as he read the part about his birth, about circumstances that didn't line up with the story he'd been told his whole life. The letter claimed his mother had made a deal to protect him, a deal that had involved cutting ties with someone who had been a part of their lives before he was even old enough to remember. But what shook him most was the last line of the letter: "You have a right to know the truth about your father." The boy sat frozen, his mind racing. His father. The word echoed in his head, bringing up a flood of emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. His father had always been a shadow in his life, someone he barely remembered and never talked about. His mother had told him he was gone, and that was the end of it. But now, this letter suggested otherwise. If what it said was true, then everything he thought he knew about his past was a lie. He didn't sleep that night. When morning came, he was exhausted but determined. He had to confront his mother. He couldn't keep carrying this weight alone. She was in the kitchen when he came downstairs, her back to him as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. "Morning," she said without turning around. Her voice was light, but he could tell she was still worried about him. "Who is he?" the boy asked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. She froze, the spoon clattering against the side of the pot. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her voice was too careful, too measured. "The man at the game," he said, holding up the photo and the letter. "And this. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you lie?" Her face went pale, and for a moment she looked like she might collapse. She pulled out a chair and sank into it, her hands trembling. "I was going to tell you," she said softly. I didn't know how." The boy's chest tightened. "So it's true?" he asked, his voice cracking. "He's my father?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "It's complicated," she said. "I did what I thought was best for you. He wasn't in a position to be the father you needed. So I made a choice." He felt a rush of anger and betrayal. "You made a choice," he repeated. "But what about me? Don't I get a say in my own life?" She reached out to him, but he stepped back. "I just need some time," he said, his voice tight. "I need to figure this out." He left the house, the photo and letter still clutched in his hand. He didn't know where he was going, but he needed air, space to think. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him, and he was free, falling into a reality he didn't recognize. As he walked, he found himself heading toward the park where he used to play as a kid. It was quiet this early in the morning, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. He sat on a bench, staring at the photo and wondering what kind of person his father really was. The man at the game had seemed earnest, even desperate. But was that enough to make up for years of absence? For the lies? He didn't notice the car pulling up until the door slammed shut. Looking up, he saw the man approaching, his expression cautious but determined. "I didn't expect to see you here," the man said, stopping a few feet away. The boy didn't respond, just held up the photo and the letter. "Is it true?" he asked. "Are you really my father?" The man's face softened, a mixture of relief and regret crossing his features. "Yes," he said. "I am." The boy felt his heart drop, even though he already knew the answer. He wanted to say something, to yell or cry or demand answers, but all he could do was stare at the man who was supposed to be his father. "I know this is a lot," the man said, his voice quiet. "And I don't expect you to forgive me or even understand right now. But I had to come. I had to try. You deserve to know the truth." The boy shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why now? Why after all this time?" The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I finally could," he said. "There were reasons I couldn't be there before. But I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped wanting to be a part of your life." He paused, his eyes searching the boy's face. "I just hope it's not too late." The boy looked away, his emotions swirling. He didn't know what to believe or how to feel. All he knew was that his life had just gotten a lot more complicated, and the answers he thought he wanted had only raised more questions. The boy sat frozen on the park bench, the man's words echoing in his ears. "I just hope it's not too late." Too late for what? To rewrite the past? To suddenly show up and expect things to fall into place? The boy clenched the photo in his hand, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, to release the storm of emotions that had been building inside him. But all he could do was stare at the ground, his heart pounding with a mix of anger, sadness, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. The man sat down on the edge of the bench, leaving a careful gap between them. He didn't push, didn't say anything more, just waited. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice low and tight. "You don't get to just show up and say you're my dad," he said. "You don't get to tell me you were gone for some reason and expect me to be okay with it." The man nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I know," he said. "I know I don't deserve anything from you. But there are things you don't know, things I couldn't tell you before." He paused, his hands gripping his knees. "The truth is, I didn't just leave. I was forced to stay away. Your mother and I, we made a deal. It was the only way to keep you safe." The boy's head shot up, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Safe from what?" he asked, his voice sharp. The man hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. "There were people," he began carefully, "people who would have hurt us if I stayed in your life. I got involved in something I shouldn't have, something dangerous. Your mother thought it was better for me to disappear than risk you getting caught up in it." The boy's mind raced. This wasn't the story he'd been expecting, and it only raised more questions. "So you just left?" he said bitterly. "You let her handle everything on her own?" The man flinched at the accusation but didn't argue. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "I thought I was protecting you. But I see now that I just made things worse." The boy shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "Why now?" he demanded. "Why come back after all this time if it's so dangerous?" The man's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "Because they're gone," he said. "The people who were after me, they're not a threat anymore. I'm free to be here now, to try and fix what I broke." The boy didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to believe the man, to let go of the anger, and just accept him. But another part of him, the part that had grown up watching his mother struggle, the part that had learned to live without a father, wasn't ready to forgive so easily. He stood abruptly, stuffing the photo and letter into his pocket. "I need time," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't just. I need to think." The man nodded, standing as well. "I understand," he said. "I'll be here when you're ready." The boy didn't look back as he walked away, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. When he got home, his mother was waiting for him, her face a mixture of worry and guilt. She didn't say anything as he walked past her, heading straight to his room. He shut the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He wanted answers, but he wasn't sure he was ready to hear them. The letter, the photo, the man's words, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Hours later, as the house grew quiet, the boy sat on his bed, staring at his phone. Without fully deciding to, he found himself searching for the man's name, trying to piece together the story on his own. What he found shocked him. Articles about a trial, about a man who had turned on a powerful group in exchange for immunity. A man who had disappeared to protect his family. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the articles, each one adding another layer to the truth he was uncovering. His father hadn't just left, he had sacrificed everything to keep them safe. But why hadn't his mother told him? Why had she let him grow up thinking his father had simply walked away? The next morning, the boy confronted her, the articles still fresh in his mind. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice shaking. She looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "Because I didn't want you to live in fear," she said. "I wanted you to have a normal life, free from the things that haunted us. I thought I was protecting you." The boy didn't know what to say. He felt a strange mix of anger, sadness, and understanding. His life had been built on a foundation of lies, but now he saw that those lies had been told out of love. It didn't make the pain go away, but it made it easier to bear. In the days that followed, the boy found himself spending more time with the man. Slowly, cautiously, he began to ask questions, to piece together the story of who his father was and why he had left. It wasn't an easy process. There were still wounds that hadn't healed, and trust that had to be rebuilt. But as they talked, the boy began to see the man not as a stranger, but as someone who had made mistakes and was trying to make amends. The final twist came when the boy discovered a letter hidden in the envelope's lining, a second message written by his father years ago, before he disappeared. In it, his father wrote about his dreams for the boy, his hopes that he would grow up strong and kind, and his deep regret for the choices he had made. The letter ended with a simple plea: "When the time comes, forgive me. And know that I have always loved you." Reading those words, the boy felt a weight lift off his chest. He didn't have all the answers, and there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, he felt like he could start to heal. The man had been a stranger at first, a mystery. But now, he was something else, something closer to what the boy had always hoped for. A father. The boy folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. His hands lingered on the edges for a moment before he set it on his nightstand. The words had settled deep in his chest, stirring emotions he didn't entirely understand but felt grateful for. He couldn't quite explain it, but the letter felt like a bridge, one that spanned the gulf of hurt and confusion that had separated him from his father for so many years. The next morning, sunlight streamed through his window as he got ready for school. He could hear his mother in the kitchen, humming softly as she made breakfast. It was a familiar sound, one that used to make him feel at home. But now, with everything that had happened, it felt different. Like it carried something unspoken beneath it. He walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table, watching her pour orange juice into a glass. "Morning," she said, her tone tentative. "Did you sleep okay?" He nodded, though his mind was racing. He wanted to ask her so many things, to demand answers to questions he wasn't even sure how to phrase. But instead, he simply said, "I read the letter." Her hand paused mid-pour, and she set the juice down carefully. Turning to him, she met his eyes, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. "I wasn't sure if you'd find it," she said softly, sitting down across from him. "I put it there years ago, hoping that someday, when you were ready, you'd understand." Her voice broke slightly, and she looked away. "I didn't want you to hate him. Or me." "I don't hate you," he said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "I don't think I ever really hated him either. I just didn't understand." And I guess I still don't. Not completely. His mother nodded, her eyes glistening. You deserve to know the truth. But at the time, I thought I was doing what was best. Maybe I was wrong. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For everything. The boy squeezed her hand, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy but comforting blanket. It's okay, he said, though he wasn't sure if it was entirely true. He wanted it to be. And maybe, with time, it would be. That afternoon, he found himself back at the park, the photo and letter tucked safely in his backpack. He hadn't planned on going, but his feet had carried him there anyway, as if drawn by some invisible force. When he arrived, the man his father was already sitting on the same bench, his posture tense but hopeful. I didn't think you'd come, the man said, standing as the boy approached. There was a hesitation in his movements, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or leave. The boy shrugged, his hands shoved into his pockets. I didn't think I would either, he admitted. But I figured we should talk. If we're going to figure this out. The man's face softened, and he nodded. I'd like that, he said. They sat down together, the silence between them less heavy than before. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't unbearable either. Slowly, hesitantly, the boy began to ask questions about his father's past, about the choices he'd made, about the things that had kept them apart for so long. The man answered honestly, his voice steady even as he recounted difficult memories. He didn't try to excuse his actions or make himself out to be a hero. He simply told the truth, raw and unvarnished. And for the first time, the boy felt like he was starting to see him not as the larger-than-life figure he'd imagined as a child, but as a flawed, complicated human being. In the weeks that followed, they continued to meet. Sometimes at the park, sometimes at a coffee shop, and once at a local basketball court, where the man tried, and failed, to keep up with the boy's sharp moves. Slowly, they began to build something resembling a relationship. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but it was real. And that was enough. At home, things started to shift, too. His mother seemed lighter, less weighed down by the secrets she'd carried for so long. She and the man had tentative conversations, their interactions careful but not hostile. The boy noticed small changes in her demeanor, a softness when she spoke about the past, a willingness to admit her own mistakes. It wasn't easy for any of them, but it felt like progress. One day, after school, the boy found the man waiting for him outside. He raised an eyebrow in surprise. "What are you doing here?" he asked, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "I thought we could go for a drive," the man said, his hands in his pockets. "There's something I want to show you." Curious, the boy agreed, climbing into the passenger seat of the man's car. They drove in silence for a while, the scenery changing from city streets to rolling hills. Eventually, they pulled up to a small house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The man parked and turned to him. "This," he said, gesturing toward the house, "is where I grew up." The boy stared at the modest home, taking in the peeling paint and overgrown yard. It wasn't what he'd expected, but something about it felt significant. The man led him inside, showing him the small living room, the cramped kitchen, and the tiny bedroom that had once been his. "It's not much," the man said, leaning against the doorframe. "But it's where I learned who I wanted to be. And where I realized who I didn't want to be." The boy nodded, his mind swirling with thoughts. He could see the traces of the man's past in the worn walls and faded photographs. It made him feel closer to him in a way he hadn't expected. Like he was finally beginning to understand. They sat on the porch as the sun began to set, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. The boy glanced at the man, his father, and said, "You're not what I thought you'd be." The man chuckled softly. "Yeah," he said. "I'm not what I thought I'd be, either." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky darken. And for the first time in a long time, the boy felt a sense of peace. He didn't have all the answers, and there were still things he was figuring out. But he knew he wasn't alone. And that was enough. For now, it was enough.